Hello, welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, a retired librarian turned homeschool mom. And in this video, as we continue exploring the world of Cecile and Marie Grace in the 1850s New Orleans, I'm going to be talking about a YouTube video that was part of the channel for the New Orleans Opera Association, where they talk about the free people of color in Louisiana and in New Orleans specifically. So this is about an hour long, it's close to an hour long. It's a little over 56 minutes video with two historians who are talking about the history very much of how New Orleans and, well, mainly New Orleans, the rest of Louisiana was a massive swamp, how things changed. So mostly it is talking about right before, not necessarily right before the American Civil War, but it talks about when New Orleans was a major city. So first, of course, it belonged to the French. And in that society, it was different because there was, I'm not going to say necessarily more freedoms for people of color, but it was easier for them to get their freedom. So they were able to buy their freedom. And Izzy, have you ever seen this one? That's it. Not hold me. That's Isabella. She's one of our I don't know how old she is. She's almost 10 months. She doesn't like to be held. But back to this. But yeah, African people of African descent had it easier. They were able to easily buy their freedom, and they could buy their family's freedom. They could be easily granted freedom. There was more instances of not necessarily legal marriage, but there was far more instances of racial mixing. And they were also mixing with the Native Americans in the area. So this was very much similar. The Spanish kept this very much the same. So New Orleans, by the time Napoleon ended up selling Louisiana, which I just read an article, I'm reading a book on yellow fever. Well, actually it's on diseases, but yeah, the reason Napoleon sold Louisiana was after the Haitian slave revolt, which was against parts where a lot of some of the Africans came over to Louisiana, and Napoleon tried to shut it down. And a good portion of his soldiers were killed by yellow fever, because of course the people living in Haiti were mostly immune, because yes, yellow fever is extremely deadly. There's a cat in here. It's very similar to diseases like the measles and the chickenpox. Once you get it, you don't really get it again. You're immune. So yeah, his army was decimated by yellow fever because of mosquitoes. So he gave up on trying to expand his empire into the Americas. So that's why he sold the Louisiana to Thomas Jefferson for a very cheap amount. You just didn't want to deal with the mosquitoes. So again, it talks about there's a big community of free blacks and people of color in Louisiana, particularly in New Orleans, when America took over. They didn't like that. They were very, very uncomfortable with that, because again, they were English, and you have that and the Civil War was brewing. So it was always in the undercurrent. In my views, just my knowledge of history, the American Civil War was in many ways inevitable. And I think from what my knowledge is, a lot of the founding fathers like Washington and Jefferson were very aware of that, unfortunately. They wanted to stop it, but they knew it was brewing. So just because of slavery and the expansion of slavery, So it was very much inevitable that this was probably going to happen. But nonetheless, when America took over, they were not happy because now they've inherited a big population of free people of color. Some of them, like in Cecile Marie Grace's, Cecile Ray's family is wealthy. Her brother was off in France going to school. She had servants. They were very wealthy. So this made the Americans extremely uncomfortable because these people had power. And so you definitely start seeing, and you see this in the books as well, they talk about how the restrictions started. We see this mentioned in Cecile and Marie Grace's books a little bit in the first book, Marie Grace, when she's out with her uncle, she sees a young black boy stopped and they ask him for his papers because now Africans had to walk around with papers to prove that they were free. You see this again in Cecile's Mysteries, where her brother is stopped and nearly taken by slave hunters, despite the fact that he is a wealthy young man. He's highly educated. He has never been enslaved. He comes from generations of free blacks. They don't care, but they have to carry papers. So, but he's nearly taken. So it shows how scary how scary things became. And there were more and more separations. The other problem, of course, when the U.S. took over Louisiana is because they had belonged to both the French and the Spanish. They were Catholic. They were very, very Catholic. And of course, most of, particularly in the American South, these were Protestants. I think a lot of the times my religion knowledge in the separate timings of these things is not great, but Baptist. I think these were Southern Baptists. So, and the Catholics and the Protestants even, this is still just the middle of the 1800s. They don't like each other. They still don't like each other. The United States has 2 Catholic presidents, just 2, Kennedy and Biden. So, Biden didn't get a second term because he pulled out, and Kennedy was killed before he completed his second term. So, moving on. But that's what this talks about, and it talks about kind of stuff that happened after the Civil War, how New Orleans wasn't, how there were issues because they were being brought in to the military, how there was a militia of free blacks who had fought during the War of 1812 for the Americans when we had to hold the Battle of New Orleans, the battle that happened after the war was supposed to be over. So, and they tried to, in many ways, not necessarily assert their power, but they had pride. They were soldiers. These were not slaves. These were free people. Some of them had come over from Haiti. Some of them had never been slaves. And the Americans did not understand that. And they did not like it. They did eventually use them, but it wasn't the South. It was the North, because the North came in and easily took New Orleans. That was a big deal, because similar to the reason they, who on earth was it? I think it was, I can't remember who the heck conquered it. It's been a while since I did Caroline's book, which is the War of 1812, and I talk a little bit about the Battle of New Orleans there. But this is the mouth of the Mississippi. New Orleans at this time was the second largest city in the United States. It was the biggest slave market in the United States. So it was huge. And then the Civil War happened, and there were problems. And then Reformation gave the African Americans a bit more power, but when they lost that, it went nuts. And a lot of the people of color left. So that's what this video is about. It talks about the free people power. It actually does talk about the Maroons. That was the other thing. which is, these were escaped slaves who were living in the bayou, also known as the swamps, because the white slavers aren't going to go in there because it's scary. There's quicksand, there's alligators, there's snakes. I'm trying to think, there probably was jaguars in there at that time. I wouldn't be surprised if there were jaguars still there. There might have still been wolves, but yeah. And mosquitoes, though they didn't realize that. Not that they didn't realize there were mosquitoes, but that the diseases were coming from the mosquitoes. But nonetheless, so they talk about them because they were, which is, I believe, I can't remember which group. It's Cecile's Mystery, which is the cameo necklace, where they talk about the Maroons a little bit. So they talk about this very, very interesting history, and how things were separate. And then Plessy Ferguson, which was the Supreme Court case that decided separate but equal, came out of New Orleans. So, and of course it was decided, again, separate but equal, or, not equal at all. But nonetheless, and something that's, again, it stood. And again, it started with trolleys, and different trolley sections. So similar to the Montgomery bus boycotts. It always starts with the money. But again, that was the separate but equal. So, which obviously was not. But that's the civil rights movement. That's a different thing. Nonetheless, so it's a very interesting historical commentary. Again, it was put on by it is the videoing of a lecture. So I think it was a virtual lecture. It was like 3 years ago. But still, it's very, very interesting. It's definitely kind of for middle school and up, but it's important, in my opinion. And what makes me sad is we don't get enough with The American Girl about talking about the free people of color, because you don't get a lot of that history. Even when I was trying to find books to cover this stuff for Cecile and Marie Grace, and I can't find a lot, particularly younger children's books on this. The other thing I'll sort of mention, they don't bring this up, at least I don't think so, no, because people talk about Maria Laveau quite enough. But yeah, she's around, again, during Cecile and Marie Grace's time. She was a free person of color. Her mother it was her grandmother. Her grandmother had bought her freedom. So she was a third generation. But it talks about the culture. It talks about a lot of very interesting things. So highly recommend this. I will link it in the description. But that is it for this review. I will be finishing up Cecile and Marie Grace. This is April Fool's Day, so it's April 1st. And then moving on to Kirsten, which I will be able to film a lot faster because she was my original doll. And then we'll be moving on to the American Civil War, though I've done Civil War stuff for this section as well. Just, again, limited materials. But we'll be moving on to the American Civil War with Addie, and then we'll be jumping into Samantha with the 1904. So we're going from Cecile and Marie Grace, which is a mixture of rich and poor, to Kirsten the Pioneer, the escaped slave, to part of the top 10%, which is Samantha. So, and then we're going back to immigration, because then we're going on to Rebecca, who's our Jewish first generation in New York, nonetheless. So, if you like what you see, be sure to like and subscribe, and check out the rest of the channel. Thank you.